see it in classrooms, waiting rooms, and under office desks. A seated person, foot planted, generating an unconscious vibration of the lower limb. Observers typically read this behavior as a nervous tic, a sign of impatience, or a minor breach of social etiquette. In many cultures, it is actively discouraged as a failure of physical discipline. Stripping away the social interpretation leaves a precise biomechanical event. Naled is executing a rhythmic vertical oscillation at a highly consistent frequency of 6 to 12 Hz. The engine driving this vibration relies entirely on the posterior crural muscles. Specifically, the soleus and gastrocnemius muscles in the calf are rapidly cycling through contraction and relaxation. This high-frequency repetition requires virtually no conscious effort to maintain. That efficiency points to the intersection of three specific biological imperatives: cortical arousal, hemodynamic maintenance, and the vestigial fight-or-flight response. The automatic leg shake functions as a sophisticated, evolutionarily conserved mechanism, a homeostatic program that activates when the body is forced into prolonged sedentary states. To analyze how this mechanism works, we must first isolate normal, physiological fidgeting from pathological tremor disorders. This diagnostic matrix compares physiological fidgeting against clinical disorders. Look at the primary sensation row. Restless leg syndrome is driven by a conscious, uncomfortable creeping sensation deep in the limb, forcing the person to move to relieve the pain. Neurotypical fidgeting occurs in the complete absence of sensory discomfort. Now look at the voluntary control row. Essential and Parkinsonian tremors persist despite the patient's intentions. Spontaneous leg bouncing is highly situational, and it stops the instant a person consciously decides to still their leg. It is an unconscious, painless rhythm. The individual rarely notices they are doing it until someone points it out. That places it strictly in the realm of functional physiology, rather than disease. We assume that all complex rhythmic movement originates as a command from the brain. In the case of the bouncing leg, the rhythm actually originates in the spine. The cycle begins with the myotatic, or stretch, reflex. When a person sits with the ball of their foot planted and the heel raised, gravity pulls the heel downward. This passive drop rapidly stretches the fibers of the soleus muscle. Embedded within those fibers are muscle spindles. They detect the sudden stretch and immediately fire a type 1A sensory signal directly up to the lumbar spinal cord. Alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord receive the signal and fire an immediate reflex contraction back to the calf. The soleus contracts, pulling the heel back up. The stretch is relieved, the muscle relaxes, gravity pulls the heel down again, and the loop resets. The continuous rhythm of this loop is managed by central pattern generators, also known as CPGs. These are ancient neural networks residing entirely within the spinal cord. CPGs are the evolutionary hardware that drives vertebrate locomotion. They generate the undulating swimming motion in lampreys and coordinate walking gaits in quadrupeds, requiring absolutely no rhythmic input from the brain to keep the beat. The bouncing leg is a fragmented locomotor cycle. It is a stationary walk operating at the exact resonant frequency of the limb to function as a biological pendulum, requiring almost zero metabolic energy to maintain momentum. If the spine generates the rhythm, the brain must still permit it to happen. We have to ask why this specific spinal reflex activates so aggressively when a person is deeply absorbed in studying, coding, or experiencing anxiety. The basal ganglia is a group of subcortical nuclei responsible for motor control. In a resting state, its indirect pathway maintains a steady stream of inhibition, effectively acting as a gatekeeper that suppresses unwanted subthreshold motor programs from reaching the muscles. Deep concentration requires massive cognitive resources. When the prefrontal cortex is overworked, it consumes the neural bandwidth required to maintain that physical inhibition. The basal ganglia's barrier weakens, and the intrinsic rhythm of the spinal pattern generators leaks through the gate. Sympathetic stress amplifies this phenomenon. High anxiety triggers the release of adrenaline, which binds to receptors on the muscle spindles, lowering their activation threshold and making the soleus hyper-responsive to gravity stretch. Leg shaking during deep concentration marks a reallocation of neural energy. The brain is prioritizing cognitive processing over the demand for motor stillness. The nervous system provides the trigger, but the muscular system provides the engine. In 2022, a study by Hamilton and colleagues analyzed the specific movement of seated plantar flexion, the exact mechanical motion of a bouncing leg. The target of their research, the Soleus, is a physiological outlier. Up to 88% of its composition consists of type 1 slow-twitch muscle fibers, densely packed with mitochondria and aerobic enzymes. This split-screen diagram illustrates muscle fuel utilization. On the left, standard skeletal muscles burn stored glycogen for energy. This anaerobic process rapidly depletes the cell's reserves and produces lactate, which signals fatigue to the brain and forces the muscle to stop. On the right, the Soleus bypasses its own glycogen stores entirely. Instead, it pulls its fuel directly from the bloodstream, functioning as a continuous metabolic sink for circulating blood sugar. Alongside blood glucose, the Soleus efficiently oxidizes plasma triglycerides, specifically the very low-density lipoproteins that accumulate during sedentary behavior. Activating this localized muscle yielded a 52% reduction in blood glucose spikes following a standard glucose challenge. Habitual leg shaking increases the body's total energy expenditure by approximately 16.3%. This small, isolated movement is enough to shift the body's metabolic rate out of the strictly sedentary danger zone. Because the Soleus draws heavily on blood plasma rather than its own glycogen, it never releases lactate. The unconscious leg shake allows this specialized muscle to perform high-grade oxidative metabolism indefinitely without triggering systemic physical fatigue. Beyond metabolism, prolonged sitting creates a dangerous hydraulic problem. The human circulatory system constantly fights gravity, and in a seated position, blood inevitably pools in the venous vessels of the lower legs. The body relies on the skeletal muscle pump to return that blood to the heart. When the Soleus contracts during a leg shake, the muscle shortens and widens. This physically bulges against the fascia and mechanically compresses the deep veins embedded within the calf. The pressure forces blood upward. As the muscle relaxes, one-way valves inside the vein snap shut to prevent backflow. The continuous rhythmic squeezing effectively lowers venous pressure in the foot. The bouncing leg is a biological hydraulic pump. It functions as a second heart, actively protecting the sedentary body from edema and deep vein thrombosis. The physical mechanics of leg shaking are clear, but a psychological paradox remains. The behavior reliably manifests during states of extreme anxiety, but also during periods of extreme boredom. This graph maps the Yerkes-Dodson law. It charts physiological arousal on the x-axis against cognitive performance on the y-axis. The peak of this inverted U-curve represents the optimal zone for focus and executive function. When a person is bored, they are under-aroused, leading to drowsiness and poor attention. Shaking the leg sends proprioceptive data back to the reticular activating system, artificially waking up the brain and pushing the body up the curve toward optimal arousal. The exact opposite occurs during high anxiety. Over-arousal scatters focus. The rhythmic movement provides a motor discharge to burn off excess catecholamines, lowering physiological tension and dragging the brain back to the center peak. This regulatory mechanism is exceptionally pronounced in individuals with ADHD. Current neurocognitive models show that ADHD is characterized by chronic under-arousal of the prefrontal cortex. For these individuals, sitting perfectly still is cognitively painful. Fidgeting triggers the continuous release of dopamine and norepinephrine. By physically moving the leg, the brain outsources the burden of arousal regulation to the motor cortex, freeing up the prefrontal cortex to sustain focus on complex tasks. Leg shaking acts as a bidirectional cognitive tuner, balancing the nervous system to maintain the brain's optimal operational state. In evolutionary biology, this behavior is classified as a displacement activity. When the primal drive to fight or flee is triggered, but social constraints require stillness, the nervous system forces a motor leakage. The energy is channeled into a compromised movement, running in place without ever leaving the chair. Modern society demands physical stillness. We spend hours immobilized at desks, in vehicles, and on couches, exposing the body to the metabolic damage and cardiovascular risks of prolonged sedentary behavior. The persistent cultural stigma against fidgeting frames this behavior as an annoyance to be suppressed. The clinical data suggests it should be recognized as a vital therapeutic tool. The automatic leg shake is a specialized biological response. By engaging these systems, the body remains metabolically active, cognitively alert, and hemodynamically stable while navigating an environment designed for stillness.